A very good evening to one and all present. I am Professor Sandeep Bansali here from the team GIBS Business School, Bangalore. Today we all are connected as a part of GIBS IRE Talks. The IRE Talk forums brings together the inspirational speakers to deliver the sessions on innovation, research and entrepreneurship. GIBS always brings imparting topics that are beneficial to the students and professionals, and today's IRE topic is should value or values drives the business agenda. I welcome all the participants to this IRE talk series on behalf of GIBS Business School family, and please allow me to share few insights about GIBS Business School Bangalore. Global Institute of Business Studies is a place where talents are nurtured, ambitions cherished, ideas shared and dreams fulfilled. GIBS Business School is a part of Goel Educational Trust, which is an exclusive business school based in Bangalore, Karnataka. GIBS provides an AICTE approved PGDM program and BBA from Bangalore University. To prepare its students for success, GIBS has designed Industry 4.0 curriculum and introduced a number of unique programs for the GIBS students, such as Innovation, Research and Entrepreneurship Program, Finishing School, Sports Management Certification Program, Business Programs, and so on and so forth. Today, I would like to extend my warm greetings to Mr. Robert Bell, the resource person of today's IRE talks. Sir, we are really grateful that you have accepted our invitation to be a part of this IRE talk series as a keynote speaker, and it's my privilege to be moderating this particular session. Before we proceed, I would love to introduce Mr. Robert. I would call him as Rob, so please allow me for that, Mr. Rob, to share your name as Mr. Rob. Okay, so I would love to introduce you. So Rob Bell is a citizen of England and was educated at St. Andrews and Oxford University. He is a fellow at Durham University Business School and a reader at Aberdeen Business School, visiting lecturer in over a dozen of universities globally. He is a frequent speaker at conferences including Globathons across India. He is the CEO of Graydon, Lloyd, and a director of Value Chain, which has also its office in Bangalore as well. He is a specialist in marketing, logistics and supply chain in developing markets. He has worked over 35 countries, including projects with the Confederation of Indian Industries. One major theme is to focus the need for the business models more responsive to develop in the developing markets, more diversity, sound ethics and sustainability. In parallel, Rob is a published playwright and a poet. Problem needs solution, informed by the humanities, just not the technologies. Sir, I would apologize for not reading out the complete profile. I would cut it down, pardon me for that. And I would request all the participants, in case if you have any queries, any doubts, and any questions, you can put it in the Q&A section. Probably we'll take it at the end of the session. Sir, Mr. Rob, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, San. And may I take this opportunity to say hello also to Dr. Lakshmi, who's been really helpful in bringing me to GIBS. Can everybody hear me okay? That's fine. Yes?
Absolutely fine.
Right. So this is the selected title, Should Values or Value Drive the Business World? Now, the real reason for the selection of this title is I think we're in a very, very complex world at the moment. And anybody involved in business is going to really have to look very carefully at this whole story of what actually underpins our business plans. And so that is really the title. And now what I'm going to do is try and unpack that as we go. Now then, let me just make sure that I can move on. So a little bit more background about me before I get going, because there is a context out of what I've been doing. I work in logistics, as San has already introduced. And the point about that is that I work with supply chains and logistics all over the world. So one thing to remember, supply chains compete, not companies. And that means that the average pair of jeans, for example, which is an illustration I'm using here, from the cotton right through to the zips and then to the store, something like 17 countries are involved in this whole process. I've worked, at the moment, I'm working in Ghana actually, looking at agribusiness, which is really about the whole story of food security and protein security. This is in Ghana. And so we're mapping things from field to fork, soil, seeds, harvest, and so on. Not that long ago, I worked in Rushikonda in Vizag in Andhra Pradesh, and I was looking at traditional fishing from those fishermen going out to catch the fish, and then the whole story of bringing them back into the market. Now, in quick summary, my job, therefore, was to go out and source things as cheaply as I possibly can, and look for suppliers, growers, the fishermen, whatever it might be, take it to assembly, but keep that as cheaply as possible in order to add value and sell more expensively in the market. Now, here's the problem. Far too often, the red bit on the left is sourcing from the developing world as cheaply as possible, giving no scope for those individuals, the growers, the transporters, and so on, to actually invest in their business. And for that reason, I started to ask very serious questions of what I was doing. And that meant, am I really in this for the value or the profit? Or am I actually trying to explore something more than this, the values that we perhaps should cherish? Now, you're going to see quite a lot of unfamiliar topics in this. And San, by the way, if you just take your video out, it's probably less distracting. San, if you pull your video off, yep. So the thing that strikes me here is that Heidegger, who very famous German philosopher, came up with a phrase, and the phrase was worlding. And what he really meant was something that Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the UK, said was, we are trying to use the economy, not just to make money, but actually the objective is to change the very soul of man, to make them more entrepreneurial and less dependent. Now, this was a very important phrase because it brings with it the question of this session. Should we use values or should we promote values in our business dealings? So I'm going to do this in three parts. I'd like us to consider growth. What does that mean? What does that imply? And then let's look at sustainability. And then finally, I'd like to come back to the question and look at value and values in more depth. A little bit of history. The whole story of growth, if you like, starts way back. But the person who's well known for commenting about it is Adam Smith. And many of you may have heard of the book, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. And it was always about, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. Now, that's a key point. And of course, the guy on the right, Karl Marx, questions this because here's the story opening up that markets are driving the business equation. Now, really fast forward, we get to the First World War and lots of things are falling over. Incidentally, I've been to India many, many times. And one of the things that's very striking is 1 million Indians actually fought in the First World War. And I've seen many of their graves in Flanders fields. And the point I would make about that is that the Indian soldiers were leaving home to fight in effectively another guy's war, and in some sense to underpin the growth aspirations of the developed world. And I question that. And so too did John Maynard Keynes, an economist that many of you should have heard of if you haven't heard of him already. Now, his position was after the First World War, the whole idea was we want to protect our growth, said the French, the British, and the Americans, but we want to punish the Germans. And Keynes turned around and said, this is really not a very good idea, because what we've got to do is escape those old ideas and look for new ones. And what he was saying was, if you have no demand in the economy, then you're not going to be able to make anything. You're not going to be able to make profit and invest back in society. So he's saying that the profit needs to be made, but it needs to be invested in society. And of course, after the First World War, we fast forward again to the 20s, when in the late 20s, 1929, we had a horrendous crash. And the crash was the economy fell over across the world and poverty raged in so many aspects. Please give my dad a job was one of the posters on the street. People were selling all of their prized possessions for peanuts. And this was a real calamity. And so people had to come up with solutions. And so as we go forward to the Second World War and we emerge from the Second World War, again, India played its part, be it in sending men to war, but also in being one of the prizes that the developed world wished to get involved in. But what happened was, of course, another collapse occurs. And so this time, learning from Keynes, to protect growth was to give more people access to it. And so the Marshall Plan did this. Now, in Britain at the same time, after the war, it was understood that if I just looked after the elite, then I was probably going to cause myself a serious problem, because my workforce would be unfit. They wouldn't be available for work. And so a thing called the National Health Service begins. And that was in 49. Now, if you mention the National Service to some redneck Americans today, they absolutely are in a rage, because they see this, as many did, as the beginning of the road to serfdom. Let me make that very clear. What was happening after the Second World War was this split between the capitalist West and the communist East, Russia and China. Now, what some of the economists, and Milton Friedman over in Chicago, were saying, and what Popper was arguing, and Hayek was making very plain, was that those who were supporting what was going on in the Soviet Union in any shape or form, socialism, the National Health Service in the UK, the Marshall Plan itself, those people were simply the tip of the iceberg. They were really opening the door for the Soviets to take over, and that would be the road to serfdom. Now, India, again, has quite a part to play in this. Nehru and so on, very heavily influenced by the idea of heavy industry to drive the economy forward. And so here's the point in terms of value or values. Milton Friedman, a world-famous economist, totally opposite to Keynes that I've mentioned before, makes it very clear when he was asked, what's the role of a firm in the economy? And he said a corporation is a morally neutral, that's very important, legal construct. And the whole idea is to maximize profit for shareholders. That's all it is. Ponder that thought. All you have to do is set up a business to maximize the profit for the shareholders. That was his position. And that is the one at issue in this talk. Now, at this time, of course, we have Cuba in 1962, where the Americans and the Russians clash. Now, by the way they clash is in Africa. They sponsor different countries. The Soviets are behind Angola, and the Americans are behind South Africa, and so on. And at that time, there was a lot of collaboration between India and the Soviet Union. And so the whole point about this is there's a clash of ideals of how to generate growth and what do you do with the growth you get. Do you give it to shareholders, or do you have a model which is more inclusive, at least in theory? Now, in the American sense, what happens is they get into Latin America And they start to source very cheaply, which is the phrase I was using earlier on, from any of the banana suppliers they can get hold of. It's instructive, is it not, those of you who are interested in brand development, that this particular company working banana plantations across Latin America uses a rifle as its logo. And I think it says more than just a pretty picture, because what they're really trying to do is to strengthen their hold on Latin America, to make sure that the profits made go to shareholders. Now, by the way, the shareholders do not live in Latin America, they live in America, New York, Chicago, and so on. And if you look at the banana on the right, it's very clear that the plantation itself is getting very little of what is being grown. And incidentally, the other thing that's happening is, with no regard to health, we're seeing people like the cigarette companies driving sales with what I would term now as a deeply unethical position. You see the child in the top left selling Marlboro cigarettes. You see the doctors saying that Lucky Strike is the cigarette that is less irritating. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. This is absolutely extraordinary. If we did this today in Europe, it would be banned. It is banned. But the point I'm making is that nobody turned a blind eye. I am building a business in the cigarette game, and I am here to make money for my shareholders. And I really don't care too much about the health of people. In fact, I'm going to use advertising to persuade them that it's perfectly safe to smoke a cigarette. Now, at this same time, you need a lab in all of this. And so those of them who were really promoting free trade, led by the developed world, the economists in Chicago were the guys who were driving this agenda. And their first lab was Chile. And in Chile, they got rid of the president, Allende, and in came another chap who, with a military coup, and let all of these ideas run riot. And this was all about privatization and making sure that the technocrats ran the country. Now, at the same time as this, Willy Brandt, the former chancellor of Germany, in 1980 said, look, this is getting very, very bad for the developing world. We need global Keynesianism. We don't want these neoliberals, that's the term that was used for those using the lab of Chile. We want to revise the terms of trade so that the developing world has more to say. And what happened was Brandt, who was working with the UN, actually gave the suggestion that $4 billion should be created as a fund to promote the development of the developing world. Now, he lost because, in effect, those who were neoliberals started to take over. And on that basis, what we end up with is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And a historian, Francis Fukuyama, writes the end of history, meaning that the whole idea of the Soviet Union and the West clashing is over, because we now have a winner, the West, the capitalist West, and we now have a loser, the Soviet model. And so this is when the whole story moves on, and it's called the Washington Consensus. We have the World Bank, the IMF, everything. And developing countries have given very, very simple advice. We want you to open up to free markets. We want you to deregulate your markets. And what we're going to do, if you do those things, you stabilize, you privatize, you liberalize, let people come in. And that meant competing with indigenous local industries, and in many cases destroying them. But the point at issue was the Washington Consensus. The West said, if you do this, we will give you financial support. Loans were organized, and that is how things started to move. You could, of course, say this is the appearance of the entrepreneur. Now, this fantastic book by Schumpeter, written in 47, it's a big book, by the way, so I thought I'd put it on one slide to help you through the 800 pages or so. He's talking of creative destruction. That is, you innovate things, and it is the case that you may innovate a new industry which will wreck another. And if you do that, it's really just a business cycle. So if it goes up, it will come down. But if it goes down, it will come up again. And the real revolutionary in all of this is the entrepreneur. And in many ways, the vocabulary of the entrepreneur was always about the personal pronouns. I, me, mine. You know, the Ferrari in the garage, the fantastic watch on your wrist, the rest of it. Very much an individual against the world in a sense, but promoting these free markets. And so the entrepreneur, loads of money, I fix stuff, that kind of individual is lauded from Bollywood through to Hollywood, through to Nollywood as well in Africa. But what we've got in this story is success, because growth takes place. This is actually a graph taken from the Financial Times. In the bottom left, you could call that 1955. And that was when global trade was no more than 68 billion US dollars. And then in the top right-hand corner, we arrive at 2019, just before the COVID concussion. And that is a time when we have 19 trillion US dollars. So this graph represents 68 billion US dollars rising, trade is rising to 19 trillion US dollars. This is massive. There are always two sides to every coin. The question now demands itself is, can we actually sustain this? And at the Sorbonne in Paris, the economics students turned around and said, this is absolutely ridiculous. And they called the economics they were being taught about free markets, about deregulation, privatization, effectively the neoliberal position, they called it the autistic science. They called economics at this time in 2000 autistic. And that very strong summary is saying we want to have much more a developing world perspective, and not just that one size fits all. As Margaret Thatcher, the then Premier of the UK, called it, there is no alternative. I would argue that there is an alternative, because along comes in 2007, the crash. You know, this is Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. Terribly sorry if there's a few swear words. It's not me, that's Star Trek for you. The whole point is that this was a terrible crash. But who's to blame? Well, of course, the banks and everybody was to blame. Alan Greenspan, the then leader of the Fed in the States, was asked, are you shocked by the financial crash? And his answer was, yes, I did find a flaw. And those of us who have looked to the self-interest of firms to promote the capitalist system, the trickle-down effect, I make money and that is trickling down. We're looking on, said Greenspan, and we're very shocked because it's not working. And many people were not too surprised, because what we've been promoting is what's called fast fashion. As the proud father of 3 daughters, we've had this discussion many times. One of my daughters actually refuses to buy new clothes. She says there's too many old clothes that aren't being used. And this is really her message on this slide, that are we promoting profits from the woman on the left, or are we interested in the lifestyle to the left or the livelihood to the right, the woman in the top right-hand corner, lifestyle versus livelihood? And the consequence of us getting that equation wrong is the bottom right, the landfill, now full to busting with all of the waste clothes that are thrown away because fast fashion is wear it once and get rid. It's extraordinary, the statistics in the Western world of people's wardrobes, that they use virtually nothing of the things they have purchased. And this is really adding to the unsustainability of our world, and yet the profitability of some. Let's not forget, of course, the paradox of plenty. And if currently I'm working a lot in Africa, and if I wander around Nigeria, Angola, the Congo, I see much evidence of very successful oil exploration. But you don't see too much of this trickle-down effect that others share in the bonanza. It's the elites, it's corruption. This is very much in your face as you wander the African continent. Yes, there are lots and lots of resources, but it depends how business is geared to either promote the inclusivity, the benefits of those resources for more than the few, or we go back to that definition of the company. It's there for making profit, and the profit is for shareholders. I would argue that we've got to start thinking about stakeholders. So let's just examine a little bit more, not growth, but now the other side of the coin, the sustainability question. Now, this is a context that many in the developed world need to really take greater heed of. In 1995, the E7, that's China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and Turkey, were half the size of the G7. That's USA, UK, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, and Italy. Now, by 2015, they were more or less the same size. But by 2050, it's very clear that the E7, India, of course, included, could be double the size of the G7. Now, this is something to really consider as we move forward. Because, of course, the development goals have been put together to give us 17 targets to take us to 2050 in one piece. And let's remind ourselves that 2050 is the date when there'll be probably about 10 billion people on the planet. 75% of those people will live in urban areas. 65% of them will live actually in 50 mega cities. And those cities are huge. When I get off the plane in Mumbai and I drive to Ballard's estate for a meeting, as you'll all know, that could take me 2 hours. You know the story of very crowded cities all too well. And by 2050, if we don't get our act together, if we don't start thinking together, we could end up with a planet that is 5 degrees hotter than it is today. Now, that has severe consequences, not least of which, not far from where you are, in Bengal, to up into Bangladesh, we're talking of an area that is very much at risk, like the Maldives, from what is happening with global warming, and that is the rising of tides. I live in a place called Hull. I'm speaking to you from there right now, and that is in the Humber estuary. And in the Ice Age and on, in the medieval age, a lot of the area I live in was underwater, and it could be again. In fact, Hull on stilts is perchance the definition of our future. So we need to be careful with those numbers, because it does mean that if we want to avoid that, we've got to focus on zero carbon. We've got to look at renewable energy. We have to, particularly after we've seen what happened with the pandemic, we have to look at global healthcare. I'm currently working on a project in Kurdistan where something like 1 million people are in refugee camps. And what I'm looking at is the logistics of how those people get access to medication. Because you might have 1 million people in refugee camps. In actual fact, right now, there are 5 million Ukrainians in Polish refugee camps. There are 5 million Syrians in Turkish refugee camps. And those individuals are not going to stay there for long. They're going to want to move. in search of opportunity, in search of security, in search of freedom. And if they do, we're going to be talking 9, 10, 11, 12 million people wandering around looking for opportunity. And no, who can blame them? Here's the point. By 2050, there are estimates suggesting we could have 1 billion people, 10% of the global population, having a nomadic existence as they're forced away from their homelands, either through conflict or climate change. This is pause for thought. Food, we're going to need 70% more food. So business plans have to change. And finally, is it enough? I hesitate to say this with a business school because, of course, you're all working hard for the moment when you get that mortarboard on your head and the certificate in your hand. But increasingly, where you in the audience are likely to change your career probably about 7 times. You'll change companies over the next few years, but you'll even on average, it's probably the case you'll change sector. That doesn't mean you'll work as your forebears probably did in one sector for life. It will now be the case that you will shift sectors more frequently. So all of this says we don't need to stop learning when we get the certificate in our hand. What do you do for the rest of your life if you're going to be changing sectors, if so much is happening out there? We need to be learning on a constant basis because we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and increasingly ambiguous world. We're being hit by black swans. Those are occurrences that were not predicted. But incidentally, politicians always explain black swans after the event as if they saw them coming. And of course they didn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. So COVID took people by surprise. The top right is actually climate change hitting Germany. And in the bottom right, we've got the monsoon hitting Pakistan. Now, I've worked in companies, as I said right at the outset, that are working with supply chains. Now, here's the point, that supply chains, if you're sourcing the average pair of jeans in 17 different countries, you know, 1 or 2 of these countries may be in monsoon areas. And we know what monsoons are like in India when they get bad. And that could mean, and I was working with Ericsson in Europe when the company Ericsson were maybe between 11 and 17% of market share. One of their suppliers fell over in Pakistan, and inside 6 months, that company, Ericsson, had exited the mobile phone market. So if we do not start to consider these factors and have resilience, we're going to get some big shocks. And on the 23rd of March, 2021, this innocent container vessel was so high in the water that a sandstorm used it as a sail and moved the ship around and hit the bank. The question is that an accident, or is this a metaphor of supply chains that are no longer fit for purpose? And now Ukraine, this is the conflict. Now, yes, of course, you can take this as a local impact. I'm working in Africa. One of our daughters is working in the paper industry, and she tells me that they had a lot of things moving on online sales. There's a problem with online sales because we've all received the package from Amazon or whomsoever, the simple cardboard box with whatever you've bought inside. Well, here's the problem. To make cardboard, you need starch. To make starch, you need wheat. And where do you get wheat from? For so many people, and across Africa, virtually all, it's a place called Ukraine. So with that conflict, it's not just a local issue. We are now seeing horrendous collateral damage because we do not share the same values anymore. And that collateral damage is even worse because we're now seeing no fertilizer. And that means the next harvest falls over. That means no jobs. And that is a calamity, because there's a wonderful thing happening. We're calling it AI and machine learning. But the consequences of that development of technology could be up to 40% of the jobs we now see will go. And this is an economics term that is not often used, but when I was an undergraduate, I came across this when I was writing an essay on the 1930s. And I remember the Pilgrim Trust saying, the unemployed cannot be put into cold storage to be taken out when needed. I lived 13 years in Madrid, and in Madrid today, something like 54% of youth are unemployed. And here's the point about hysteresis. Imagine that rubber band, stretch it again, stretch it again. Well, at some point, it will not just return to its previous shape, it will snap. A rubber band does not always return to its original shape. Somebody who's unemployed may not be able to be productive going forward. So we close with value or values. We talked about globalization. Yeah, it's pretty good for some, but it is not good for all. And of course, you could argue, well, that's the way it goes. But the reality is an unequal world, and this is not a Soviet position, it's not a socialist position. It's if you don't have people who can sustain their lives, you have no demand to buy all of this stuff that is being produced. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is democracy and autocracy. And let's not forget that Hindutva is in this as well. We need to be careful that we understand and unpack the consequences of this. I'm not taking a position for any religion, and I'm not taking a position for any political party in this talk, but I am presenting the facts onto the table for you to interpret. And in my view, the facts about democracy is the attempt, at least, to open it up to more. But the fact about autocracy is you can't vote a guy who's a unique leader out of position very easily. It'd be almost impossible, if you so wished, to disagree and oust some of the leaders on the planet today. Is that the way that we go forward? Because what we've got to be clear on is that we have a choice. Do we have a rules-based multilateral solutions sustainable 2050? That's the boxing ring with the ring, or do we have a zero-sum game of unilateral decisions where 2050 could be, and almost certainly will be, 5 degrees hotter? So along comes one of my favorite Indians. His book would say The Argumentative Indian, and that is Amartya Sen. I was very lucky actually to be at Oxford when he was there. And I actually lived on a staircase, and he was on that same staircase. And this is one of my missed opportunities of life. I didn't know much about India back then, and I really didn't feel that I knew anything about economics. So I didn't really maximize that opportunity at all. And the big lesson he gave me in life has been, he puts the word ethics firmly into economics. He won the Nobel Prize for economics for this. Hailing from West Bengal, he's made very clear that if we go all the way back to the Arthashastra, the first real economics textbook, it's not the West that can say that, but this text, The Wealth of Nations, is written by a man, Adam Smith, who wrote a book before that book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it is not the case that economics is purely about profit, because the same guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and many people suggest that that's what he's saying, is the guy who writes The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which, as Sen makes very clear, is all about the morality of economics, not just the profitability of it. And there's a lovely word I found in looking at this neoliberal society. This is Dardot and Laval, two French economists, and they talk of the jouissance of existence. And this is actually a wonderful word. It means delight or ecstasy for oneself, for oneself alone. And that manifests itself as this shareholder logic, the self-entrepreneur, and it's the financialization of natural resources, that everything has its price. There's no social commons, and it is a progressive commodification of society, the jouissance, the I, me, mine of the world, not the collective, but I'm fine, I don't really care about you. And just in defense of markets, Sen makes it very clear that markets are, you can't just get rid of them. I like nothing better than going to a street market and having street food in many of the cities of India, because markets, as Sen says, are generically part of conversation. The tirade against this I, me, mine culture is very clear. And on my bookshelf, I've got The Shock Doctrine. If you haven't read it, you should. The whole idea of inequality from Stiglitz, from Piketty. The whole point about this is inequality is actually quite dangerous for capitalism. And yes, there have been words, C.K. Prahalad, a great writer, but I would question actually that it isn't a pyramid we have now. We have a diamond with the middle classes. And this book, in saying there's a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, the question is, who's the fortune for? Is it for developed world companies, or is it more equitably shared? The banker to the poor got a Nobel Prize. I would question microfinance, because yes, you can help somebody get money to buy that sewing machine, but the idea of investing in a room of sewing machines that a cooperative would do, being an Amul, the first $1 billion brand in the dairy industry in India, that's a cooperative. That's not built on microfinance, which I believe is actually quite dangerous. And of course, the other thing is, we've talked a lot about countries in this value versus values mix, but have we noticed that many of the biggest companies now, the tech giants, are far than most of the countries? Apple, for example, is way bigger than Italy, Brazil, Canada, Russia, Korea, Australia, Spain, Mexico. This is pause for thought, because it's not just about Mr. Putin. It might well be about quite a lot of the tech titans who are even more threatening to the values of our society. Again, pause for thought. The economics behind some of the things that we take as read. Coffee, the breakdown so that the grower gets 1p in London, and it's no longer 2.50, by the way, it's closer to £3 and more. This is a world that can have the shanty towns of Dharavi in Mumbai, cheek by jowl with the commercial district of Mumbai. Is this the world that is sustainable? Is it giving us food security? We're at a situation now, by the way, where we may have had experience as a species of eating 600 different plants, but remarkably, 75% of the calorific intake of our society is actually provided by 9 plants. And we've just seen what's happening with wheat. So we're down to 8 to supply 75% of our. This is ridiculous. We need more diversity in the plants grown and more locally sourced, because the miles on the plate we are eating are just ridiculous. Now, again, I'm a big enthusiast of Sen, Stiglitz and Fitoussy's Mismeasuring Our Lives. It's 100-odd pages. It's really worth putting on your bookshelf. And it asks the question, is GDP the way to measure success? And the answer is no. It's got to be a dashboard of metrics around people, planet, and profit. We need balance in our measures. We also need to invest not just in the tractor, but also in the skills and the spare parts to make sure that the outcome is not the one on the right. We're back at worlding. We're back at that word that comes to suggest that our economics need to shape our lives, need to help us along in thinking through. The object is to change the soul. Well, that was the neoliberals' quest. I would say that now we have to renew that quest, but we have to perhaps take a leaf out of a book. And this is by Kautilya. Now, those of you who recognize this, the Arthashastra has been called the very first economics textbook. It's also been likened to a rather pragmatic and Machiavellian world, Machiavelli being the advisor to the prince in Medici, Italy. And the point about this is this came at a time when we have Ashoka, the emperor, and we have Kautilya, who's the administrator. And I put it to you that as we consider this question of value, profit, or values, where we're considering sustainability, where we're considering far more, I put it to you that actually we are living in a Kautilyan world, more bothered about value, profitability, but we need more than ever an Ashokan ethic to drive what is happening. Thank you for listening, and I would value any questions you might give me. So what I'll try and do now is move my screen away, and I'll stop sharing so I can see some of your questions. Thank you.
Rob, that was really an amazing and indeed very, very informative session what you had. I think you have took us throughout the globe on the various aspects which you dealt in. So that was really amazing. And then one thing which struck me was to choose between the lifestyle or the livelihood. So I would say that was one of the best things which I got out of it. And there are a few questions which has been posted by our participants. So
sure.
if I have the permission, can I read it for you, sir?
Where you go. But by the way, just be careful with this word, sir. No hierarchy here.
I apologize again.
Yeah, I mean this. No, we are all in a quest to learn, me included. And whilst it's the format for this, I do like it when I'm working with students live. It's much more of a workshop atmosphere where people can fly questions at me, because we're all in this to learn, me included. It's not a hierarchy.
Absolutely right. So the first question has been asked by Chaitra. She says, how should management strike a balance between the need for constant growth and preservation of corporate values?
Well, of course, any business has to make a profit or else it goes out of business. And I accept that. However, one of the miscalculations, I spend a lot of time working with businesses where we do scenario planning. And I have an exercise where I sit down with them. Incidentally, I've been doing this a lot in universities as well, where we just put 2050 on the board. And I ask people, I say, I'm just going to give you 4 numbers. I'm going to tell you that 2050 is when we'll have 10 billion on the planet. You saw the numbers earlier. 75% will live in urban spaces. 2011, it was only 50%, by the way. And about 65% of that number will live in massive, massive cities. We could be 5 degrees more. Stop. Right. What do you think that means in terms of food, in terms of water, and so on? And, you know, when you start to consider that the hamburger that some of you might even eat for lunch is 2,800 liters of water embedded in it, you start to really see that the point is that the value, the profit of the business is beginning to be increasingly linked to the values the business brand is identified as having. So if you are known to be having a supply chain that evidence is mounting that child labor is used, that reflects upon your brand. So we're not in a position where I can make profit without values. We used to be in a situation where people could make cigarettes and produce a piece of advertising that said that this was good for kids. You know, we're not in that position anymore. So increasingly, the other thing is youth is saying, no, no, I do not wish to buy your brand because you are not respecting the sustainability position. So this is going to sound like the Swedish woman, the young lady who's really causing a lot of politicians to think again, because she's saying, look, you're full of blah, 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 blah. Lots of reasons why you can't to consider values because of profitability, but that's wrong. You know, we have 3 daughters. I've used the example, one of them, Lucy, refuses to buy new clothes on principle because she says, why should I do that? Because the question is not, isn't that a lovely dress or isn't that a great shirt you're wearing? It's who made it. Is it a child? Is it throwaway prices so that nobody who grows the cotton is going to earn any profit to reinvest in the business? Surely we are sophisticated enough to ask questions about the profitability that is being made. On whose back? I hope that emphasizes the point that we do not make profit in a business in isolation from global values. Because, for example, if you currently make anything using coal, don't buy it. Don't even try to sell it.
Absolutely. I mean, we should know the reason to buy that. Is it is what it is?
Yeah. Any more questions?
Yeah. We'll take up the next question. Is by Pragya, are the organizational values essential or they are mere rhetoric?
Are you saying if somebody says they've got these values, is that just, for example, greenwashing? Yeah. I used a phrase in the early part of the presentation where I talked about supply chains compete, not companies. Now, there are many companies in the West, in the developed world, who say that they have got a certificate of corporate responsibility, for example. There are many of them now that are getting a certificate that says your company is green. But no company is green unless its supply chain is green. And so I think that's a very shrewd question. And I would say that the real answer, Mr. Company, Miss Company, is this. I know that you say that your shop on the high street in London is green, but I know that the people who pick the cotton are on subsistence wages, and they can't afford to get a cart, let alone a truck. And so are you feeling good about that, that you've got the green certificate for your shop, but all of your product is coming from people who simply are destitute? That isn't appropriate. And we have to consider the values of the supply chain. Now I go one further. I don't like this term supply chain. So I use the term value stream. There's a reason. I'm working currently in Ghana, and I'm working on the coast where the slave trade began. And the slave trade saw people being put in chains to be taken in a supply chain to the plantations of America. And I believe, therefore, we need to drop the word chain. We need to use the word stream, because it's never a case these days of a pass the parcel, one company to the next company to the next company. It's many, many things coalescing together. And so this is the problem now, that you do not have one product made in one place. You have the trade of goods today says that 70% of everything that moves around the at sea is components. It's not finished goods at all. And that means that we're so interconnected that it is no longer the case. The shrewd question returns that I just have, I have a great shop, I have a great company, I do all the things beautifully, but I'm only able to do that out of profits that I make at the expense of others. That has to stop.
Absolutely right. As you said that the jeans is made in 17 different countries, so when we have to value the stream rather than the chain.
That's right. And I think that the other point is I'm not arguing against profit. I'm not, as Sen said, arguing against markets. But I am saying that even if I walk into a market, I have to respect the ethics of that market.
Very, very true, sir. We'll take the next question. That is, this has been asked by Revati. How does a change management process benefit a business?
Say that again.
How does a change management process benefit a business?
Well, the change management process is very simple for me. It's vital. And I'll tell you for why. I'm working as we speak on something where I've learned from the developing world, and it's this. Let's put on this side of the fence supply chain. Let me now take supply out of the equation. We need to be closer to demand, not supply. Supply suggests, San, that I'm pushing things to you. I'm using social media to make you buy. I'm supplying you. I don't really care, but I want you to buy, right? And that's the supply. Well, if I go back to 2050, I would suggest we need to change that. We need a value stream, but we need that to be called a transitional. And that means identify what needs to change in the run up to 2050. That means to be sustainable. That means to reduce our carbon footprint. That means all of those things. So there's got to be a transitional element, and there's got to be a transformational element, which means if I've identified the transition, what I have to do, the transformation is how do I make that happen? This is the change process that every business, there are no exceptions, must make. So for example, all of the businesses during COVID who moved online with their sales require those cardboard boxes, because that's how you send it to the last mile. That's how you deliver the last mile. But what happens if there's no starch, therefore no cardboard? Do you use plastic, which is unsustainable? Or do you actually start going around India to look for cassava, and you use cassava as the substitute for wheat to give us the starch, to make our own cardboard, and from that package what would be required to send to the home? So we have to change the business model, and the process, I would say, is a transitional and transformational one. And that is the book I'm currently writing, by the way, the transitional and transformational value stream.
That's.
But by the way, that's a completely different talk. So if anybody's interested, invite me back, and I might even do that one.
I'm sure that I'm going to be the first person to buy that book, but provided I have the information that once it is being published. So thank you so much, Rob, for that. But we'll take up one last question for the day. So what about mantra stabilize, liberalization, and globalization?
That's a massively important question. Globalization, I think, has got to become glocalization, because we're going to have to be more local, because I'm not against the global supply chain, but we are finding that, for example, I worked in Japan many years ago, and I learned a lot about just-in-time delivery. Well, of course, now we've got to have just-in-case delivery because the supply chains are falling apart. We saw that with Suez when something like inside a few hours, $9 billion worth of goods were blocked in the Suez Canal, which is about 10 to 15% of global trade goes through that canal. Now, here's your problem. What happens if we have a problem in Ukraine that continues? What happens if wheat isn't a crop we can rely on from Ukraine for the next 5 years? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's already happening. There are food riots in North Africa already. And if there's a food riot in Egypt, where does the Suez Canal run? It runs through Egypt. So globalization could be a massive risk if we do not change, back to the word change, if we do not transform its transition to being more local. So for example, I'm looking at big cities and knowing that a lot of youth, a lot of you guys at GIBS, you're not going to want to work in rural areas of India. You want to be in the big cities. You want to be in the Leopold Bar in Mumbai. You want to be where it's happening. So we've got to start thinking of agribusiness in the city. We've got to look at vertical farms. We've got to look at rooftops, flat rooftops to grow vegetables, because we're going to have real problems unless we are innovative. So globalization needs to be very careful. It needs to move on. Now, the word liberalism, now this is a loaded question, because liberalism, if I go back to my favorite weekly read, is The Economist magazine, newspaper. It's not a magazine. And I read it because it's full of opinion and analysis. And it was founded in the 1840s as a journal, if you like, of liberalism. And it meant free markets, and it meant all of those things. But even The Economist has an article written in October of last year, by the way, which was the whole idea of world trade. You've got to be careful that liberalism isn't neoliberalism. I would have liberal values, but I certainly don't have neoliberal values. Neither do I feel that they are one and the same. The word freedom is very important in liberalism, but that freedom to carry guns out of Walmart in North America, in the US of A, is not a freedom that I recognize as being one I want to support. I think freedom implies discipline. It implies rules. And so what I'm talking about is rules-based world politics, where autocrats cannot just change their mind overnight in North Korea and risk everybody else. We have to have rules-based politics based on liberal shared values, not neoliberal shared values, much more inclusive than that, in order for globalization to even survive the next 5 years. And if we don't, we'll all go back to our individual countries. We'll all protect our own individual self-interest. And at that point, we cease to learn from each other, and we cease to see that bit of the other, which is actually ourselves. And my family is originally Irish. My family came to England as migrants. I am very supportive of migrants because I come from migrants, and I am not a Brexiteer in my own country. Because I'm a liberal and I believe in globalization, but I believe in the two words when we have a rules-based position that actually observes humanity, not sectarian views. No, it respects faith of any description. It respects secular views as well, because look, I'm advancing here some questions. I'm not advancing a dogma, and I'm using a word that is often, well, is rarely used these days. my biggest asset is my own sense of doubt, my own sense of the value of failure. You know, you can't have a startup unless you are prepared to fail. You can't learn another language unless you make a mistake with the words or the grammar. And I think we have to get back to that view that love, as the great French poet once said, Baudelaire, the great French poet, once said, love is getting out of yourself. You name me one of the political leaders of the world whose love of their country is so strong that they are prepared to get out of their own position to share the thinking and the learning with others. And I'll give you a long, long list of people who have self-regard, but that is a selfish regard. It's not liberal, it's not global, and it's not sustainable. And it's because of that that we need values, not just value.
Absolutely. I must say that one who has the quest of learning, I'm sure there are a lot of possible solutions, and change is one thing which every individual must look in himself and move forward.
You don't learn at university the answer to every question. You learn to question.
Very well said, sir. Very well said. I want one small thing from your end, Rob, since you have traveled across the globe, even in the India, you have traveled across different places. So I really want to you give us one message to our participants. If you have to give us a message, what would be the message for this era of generation of students, or we have a lot of professionals who have joined with us today. So one message from your end, please.
Well, I think that one of the realities that all of the students are going to face is the big corporations will not employ all of you. So some of you are going to have to think of starting your own businesses. Some of you are going to have to be entrepreneurs. I'd like to be careful about the word entrepreneur. It does not mean I, me, mine. It is not just about money in the bank, because many of you will become entrepreneurs and you'll fail. So you need to have a healthy respect and learn from your, not just your successes, because you don't learn much from success. So I think the first thing is to really have a healthy regard for that whole sense of questioning yourself. So I think that's the first thing. I'm the father of 3 daughters, so I've got to say this. I really think males have to be the biggest feminists. They've got to have a greater respect for females. They've got to understand that females are just another part of the equation. They are not a separate people. And so I think that gender is a massive thing. I mean, I feel that I've had my own businesses several times, and I remember setting up a business in Spain, and that business ended up with 850 people. Over 80% of the management were female. That was in Spain. It's quite a misogynistic country. And somebody once said to me, a male at a dinner where all the males were, and he laughed and he said, "You're the feminist company." And I said, yes, you could say that. And he said, what the hell do you do that for? And I said, it's very simple, because I actually believe that I am at a huge competitive advantage, because I know that none of you will hire a female and put that female in a management role. So I have no competition for the best brains.
Amazing.
So gender is definitely something that males must understand, that they have a responsibility to select females and be prepared to work with females and be managed by females. And I say that in India because some of the greatest women I've ever met, one of my favorite poets is an Indian from Madras called Tishani Doshi. She's amazing. Any of you like poetry, I've just done a reading of some of mine. Tishani Doshi is one of the gems of India, absolutely extraordinary woman. You have some of the best women on the planet today, and I'd rather hope that your leadership will have a few more women in it pretty quickly, because it's needed. So gender is a big one. The other one, of course, is be open to the fact that if you're going to be an internationalist, you must be international in your peer group. You know, you want to be trying to learn from other places and the rest of it. 3 daughters, they've spent a lot of time in Latin America. They're in their 20s, by the way, all 3 of them. One of them's just graduated from Glasgow University, and as I speak, she's going to be coming up the drive of our house. She's just cycled from Glasgow to Yorkshire as she finished her degree. So, you know, I'm a big fan of women in industry, because that's going to help us. We're going to have more brains involved, not just these closed mind males, which is one of the biggest dangers the planet now faces. And I think, very simply put, whatever you do, if you're a scientist, do not abandon the humanities. And if you're in the humanities, do not throw away your pocket calculator. Because if you're in the humanities and you become a manager, you'll be responsible for budgets. So you're going to have to get used to it. But if you are somebody involved in science, technology, engineering, or maths, be careful. Because I was in a session the other day and I put 2 letters up: AI, artificial intelligence. And you could see half the room who do the arts just didn't want to be there. And the other half just wanted to talk about the technology. And I said, right, I'm going to ask everybody in the room a question. Is this man's last invention? And the question leads to the humanity in all of us. We have to be prepared to ask and answer some of the deepest philosophical questions you'll ever have encountered. And that will be the role of great leaders going forward. Get used to it. Do not say you're a scientist and exclude humanities. Do not say you're the poet without the calculator. Understand, as Steve Jobs, who launched Apple, once said, some people say that Apple is a technical company. It's not. And he said, he made a fantastic phrase. He said, without the scientists and the technologists, alongside the poets and the artists, we cannot have a business, but together they make the heart sing. And I guess that's the last thing I've got to say. An urge to all of you to not see your role as, I'm a scientist, I'm a humanities guy. Understand the Venn diagram and really focus the intersecting set.
Thank you so much, Rob. It was amazing having you with us. I must say I have been overwhelmed with the kind of information which you have shared with us. And just for the information, I would say today in GIBS we have moreover a woman-based team with more than about 60+% works as the women who are leading the team entirely in GIBS specifically. So I'm glad to be a part of that, such wonderful organizations here at Bangalore. So
well,
that's
let me say this. I love India. I haven't been for a while because of COVID and everything. Give me the invite. I'll be on the plane, and I'd love to work with students. No problem.
We would love to have you. We are just eagerly waiting. Any day you're there in India, please do let us know. We would love to have you, and I'm sure you would love the kind of students what we have in GIBS are really amazing. So I wholeheartedly, I would welcome you to GIBS. Any day you're there in India, you're most welcome. So I'm sure in the coming days, we'll have you in campus as well.
Over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity. And this is the odd thing of these Zoom calls. I can't see any of your faces, but I've been to India often enough, and I read, you know, Tagore. I read quite a lot of stuff. I really like. I'm just reading the Mahabharata right now. I'm reading a fantastic book by Gurcharan Das, which is all about how to be good, actually. And there's so much in the Arthashastra and so on. But one book you've got to read, well, basically anything by Amartya Sen. The Argumentative Indian, brilliant.
The Argumentative of India, okay.
Argumentative Indian.
Argumentative Indian, all right.
He's brilliant. Okay, look, you've just been listening to the great Chinese sage, On Too Long.
Thank you so much for that. It's an overwhelming. It's time to show a little gratitude towards Rob. You've been really helpful and informative in helping all of us gaining a little more knowledge, learning more. Yes, please.
Final thing, San. I'm going to write a summary of this. I'll put it on my LinkedIn page. And would you coordinate some comments onto that LinkedIn page, please? I'll be posting it over the weekend.
Certainly, yes. I request all the participants. Mr. Rob is available on LinkedIn as well. So I would love if you can share your thoughts, to summarize whatever your learnings were there. You can just put it on the LinkedIn profile. So that would allow everybody, all of us, to learn even more.
Yeah, by the way, I'll put the summary on over the weekend, so it'll be there from Monday. And if you could coordinate a few comments, I'd appreciate that.
Certainly, we'll take care about that, Rob. Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend, everybody. And I'm jealous because you're in my favorite country. It's my second home.
We would love to welcome you. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all the participants for joining with us. And kindly note, do follow Mr. Rob on LinkedIn and even the GIBS so that you stay updated with the further upcomings, IRE talks as what we had today. Thank you so much. Have a great time ahead, Rob. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much.